I usually don't like to give away secrets about my undertaking, but for you video game fans, I think I can dig up a few.
The WWE, once known as WWF or the World Wrestling Federation, back when awe and mystery still surrounded pro wrestling as a whole, back when it was an athletic event of near superhero pageantry, elevating the likes of Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, and Mr. Perfect to that of low-tier superhero status. The world, or at least the consumers of professional wrestling, were pulled in buying what WWF was selling, hook, line, and sinker. While it's easy in modern times to look back at the vignettes or watch the interviews and question how anyone could believe it was entirely real, all I can say is people did, and without the internet, there was no way to question or expose the sport for those who doubted. John Stossel himself tried exposing the pro wrestling industry as being an act in 1984, and well...
You know,
Standard question.
I think this is fake.
You think it's fake? What's that? Is that fake? Huh? What the hell's wrong with you? That's open hand slap, huh? You think it's fake? You come like this in the face? Huh? What do you mean?
It didn't go so well. Stossel for his part sued the WWF and received a settlement of nearly $500,000. It wasn't just the occasional wrestler who took the matter of protecting the sport's secret seriously. The WWF went to great lengths trying to convince people that what they were being fed was legitimate. One of the greatest wrestlers to ever live and a personal favorite of mine is the $1 Million Man. While there are a ton of examples of the lengths the WWF went to in an attempt to convince people that the show was 100% real, none are as amazing as the one involving the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. This is Retro Impressions WWF WrestleMania, a definitive analysis. Ted was a second-generation pro wrestler. His mom, known as Helen Heil, and his stepfather, the Iron Mike DiBiase, were very prominent in the industry, being major influencers in the sport during their active years. Both parents were known for their work ethic, in-ring ability, and general likability. Helen and a 15-year-old Ted would see tragedy strike when they lost Mike during a wrestling match in 1969. The event would fracture the family, but the call to follow in his mother's and father's footsteps was something that only got stronger with each year that passed. It wasn't long before Ted joined the profession and started a contract wrestling for the WWF in the 70s. He even has the distinction of being Hulk Hogan's debut match opponent. He spent most of the 80s bouncing around different wrestling organizations before finding a long-term home in Japan. In '87, he accepted a contract with the WWF shortly after returning to the States. The character he was given was created by Vince McMahon himself and was a new persona unlike anything that had ever been attempted. The concept, a rich jerk who bought and sold his way to success at the expense of the working man.
And you also know that I'm a very, very wealthy man. That's right, I'm filthy rich. I'm loaded. As I look around this auditorium tonight, I see an awful lot of poverty.
It was pure genius for a heel character. The success was predicated on people believing that DiBiase was in real life the man portrayed on TV. Typical of this era, wrestlers traveled by the cheapest means possible, stayed in trash hotels, while eating at the cheapest restaurants. Not DiBiase though. From the moment he became the $1 Million Man, Vince made sure he only flew first class, stayed in the nicest hotels, and ate at the best restaurants. He was given a personal limousine, full-time chauffeur, personal bodyguard, and a bottomless pocket full of $100 bills to toss around in display of his wealth. For as long as DiBiase was working for the WWF, he would be required to remain in character while in public at all times. It helped to grow the legend when people who attended these events saw wrestlers as they traveled and took note of DiBiase. Fans quickly spread word around that this guy had money. A number of vignettes would air showing DiBiase paying to get his way at the expense of other people. After all, the $1 Million Man's motto was, "Everyone's got a price, everyone's got to pay, cause the $1 Million Man always gets his way."
Everybody's got a price for the $1 Million Man.
Not only was the dedication to maintain people's belief in the character central to his and other wrestlers' popularity, it also led to some of the best storylines of all time, including my all-time favorite. DiBiase wanted to win the World Championship belt, but he wasn't good enough, so he paid Andre the Giant to win the belt from Hogan, then turn around and surrender it to him. When the WWF caught wind, he was stripped of the title even though he had already defended it on a few occasions. In turn, he created his own title called the $1 Million Championship and crowned himself king. It's a character that could only work in an era where everyone believed wrestling was without question real. The sport of professional wrestling was regulated by a few states, the most famous of which was New Jersey, helping to legitimize the sport until Vince McMahon testified in front of the New Jersey State Senate that professional wrestling was just entertainment. The testimony was compelling enough that they voted to deregulate it by a vote of 37-1. Still, it remained essentially unknown to most viewers that it was indeed staged. A lot of fans seemed to miss this event in the news or believed it was a story spun by Vince to reduce regulation of a dangerous sport while increasing profits. At this point, you might be wondering where this trip down memory lane is heading, or why I decided to take this path to start a video meant to analyze a wrestling arcade game. To be frank, prior to this game's release, wrestling games for the most part were essentially simulations. For me, it's just hard to imagine the WWF allowing this game to be made had their position not moved away from a hardline effort to protect the secret behind the sport. It's a position change that for all intents and purposes allowed for the arrival of the Attitude Era and for a wrestling game that wasn't at all a wrestling game. WWF WrestleMania was made by Midway using the same system made popular by Mortal Kombat. It's a fantasy-style fighting game based around WWF characters. There's no real story beyond trying to win a specific division. Select who you want to be, and you're off to capture the Intercontinental or World Championship belt. The main difference between the two is how many handicap matches you'll have and how outnumbered you'll be. Playable characters include Bret the Hitman Hart, Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, Bam Bam Bigelow, Doink the Clown, Razor Scott Hall Ramon, Lex Luger, and Yokozuna. The inclusion of Doink the Clown was rather questionable as he didn't appear in the WrestleMania prior to this game or the one after. Kevin Diesel Nash was also oddly not included even though he was the reigning champion at the time. It's said that this was purely at the request of the WWF for unknown reasons. The action is fast-paced, over-the-top, and silly fun. Because a home version already existed under the same name, it was changed to WWF WrestleMania the Arcade game when ported home. We're going to look over every version released. This includes DOS, Saturn, 32X, Genesis, SNES, and PSX. With that said, it's on to the breakdown. First up, let's talk about sound. I want to say up front that you'll have to either take my word for some of this or look into it yourself for verification. The WWE is dead serious about taking down videos, so I'm treading lightly when I think it's required. First off, we need to talk about the arcade release even though it's not in contention. Any theme song you might associate with a wrestler plays so seldom, you might question if they're even in the game. When they do play, it's for short bursts only because outside of what I feel is annoying battle music, the theme songs are mostly limited to less than 30-second samples. For the most part, the audio implementation is poorly executed with only 3 very similar songs as the total music available during matches. Howard Finkel is the announcer, with commentary courtesy of Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler. There seemed to be potential for something memorable, though the end result left me scratching my head in regard to the way the music portions were somehow mishandled. Moving on to the console versions, I really had to weigh quite a few things and listen to the audio numerous times to come up with a ranking I felt was just. In last place is the PSX release. The PSX release uses its onboard sound processor to handle the music, and what's there sounds good. However, I'm left wondering what the heck the person responsible for arranging the audio was thinking. First off, there is no music during matches. In the arcade and most other home versions, your character's entrance theme is played at the start, then the victor's music is played between matches. When you beat the game, your character's theme once again plays. It's a simple formula that works by giving players what they expect. That's why it's simply a mystery as to what the heck's going on here. I played through the PSX release and beat the game a number of times recording each session, then looked over the footage to be sure I wasn't going crazy, but not once does any entrance music for any wrestler play. It's just not in the game, and if it is, it's hidden so deep, there's no reason it should have been included. In comparison to the other versions, there's also less commentary.
Versus Bret Hart. No one can touch him.
In 5th is the SNES version. Coming in 5th here isn't a bad thing because the SNES version is quite good at emulating what the arcade does. In fact, it includes slightly longer renditions of each wrestler's theme when compared to the arcade. Very solid work for what's there, but the unfortunate bit is it's missing content. I'll come back to this in a more appropriate section though and explain it in depth. This might be a shocker, but the game that comes closest to the arcade in the sound department is the DOS release. What might be even more shocking is that I consider these two versions to have the 4th best audio of the bunch. While the arcade release isn't necessarily in contention, it's the benchmark by which all others are measured, and in this case, the bar was set low enough that there was room for improvement. If you want the closest experience to what the arcade offers, stop here because the DOS release is the only one that executes it to near perfection. What really keeps this version down is all the licensed music is mostly 20 to 30 second clips on loop. It's a bit nitpicky, but I found it annoying that all I got after beating the game was an annoying 20-second sample of the wrestler's theme on a continuous loop. 3rd is the Genesis. To be clear, if you don't like chiptunes, nothing I'm gonna say will change your mind here. What the sound team delivered is, in my opinion, very well done. It's not a surprise either, considering members who worked on this soundtrack are responsible for music in Diablo 2, World of Warcraft, King's Quest, Quest for Glory, and a whole ton of additional classic games. It faithfully recreates the arcade experience in its own way while really going the extra mile by including full chiptune versions of each wrestler's theme. There's less commentary than the arcade and DOS release, but overall it's a very solid use of the hardware available. Second is the Saturn release. It's unfortunately a very odd mixed bag. Again, short samples are used, making most of the songs 5-minute long versions of a 30-second sound clip on loop. The Saturn version has one major downside. Like the PSX release, there is no music during matches. However, it's the only version to have a full Redbook audio sound and commentary track. By a country mile, it's the best sounding of the bunch. In comparison to the PSX release, the Saturn release contains a ton more sound effects and the full commentary track as well. Heck, there's even a 10-minute track dedicated to cheesy one-liners spoken during the match.
For the Hitman, it doesn't look good for Yokozuna. Get up, Doink. Get up, Shawn. Get up, Ramon. Get up, Undertaker.
While I feel it's a personal preference as to if no match music is a good or bad thing, I think the better choice would have been an option to switch it on or off, but I have a feeling the commentary being Redbook audio is one of the reasons this didn't happen. What really keeps this from the top spot is the short samples. It honestly just drives me crazy that there's nearly a full disc of Redbook audio and none of it worthy of putting into a Discman for that tractor ride around the property in early spring. On top is the 32X, cleaner audio, better samples, and awesome chiptunes. It's the best of the bunch, utilizing the hardware on hand to create an epic experience. If you love great chiptunes, the 32X does an awesome job. It's the Genesis version, but much better. That's not to say the 32X version is perfect though, as the included commentary track is rather limited. There's no perfect version as far as audio is concerned, with each release having a considerable amount of give and take. Up next is visuals. Feel free to pause the video and look over the screen. What you're seeing is the same Undertaker displayed in order by in-game sprite size across the same setting. I'm gonna reveal which one is from which version in a minute, but take a second to make an educated guess. As I've said in the past, digitized images fare terrible on the Genesis, and with this game, there is no exception to that rule. The colors are washed out, giving it an almost vintage 70s look. There are small things missing that are present in every other version too, things such as the pseudo blood each character spills when hit, Yokozuna dropping food, Shawn Michaels spilling out hearts, etc. There are other missing background assets and pieces here and there, making the package feel a bit shallow. The character sprites are also a bit too small, with the whole package leaving a lot to be desired. The SNES version comes in 5th. What's there looks fine, but there's quite a bit missing, including 2 wrestlers. What's on screen is also a bit too much for the hardware to handle, making me question why they did this. Once again, I'll be talking about this in depth in a moment, but for this section, the visuals that are there are okay. 4th is the 32X. The Genesis handles the background while the 32X takes responsibility for the character sprites, making them fairly large. The result? It looks very good. There's the typical dithering you would expect from assets not specifically designed for the hardware, but all in all, it's very well executed. If I had any complaint, it's that this version is locked at 30 frames per second, causing a jittering effect when the action is at its fastest. There's no slowdown, it's just visually odd in rare instances. Third is the PSX. Most things in this version look great, but it's oddly missing some things that are just weird. Things all other versions have, such as the ringside announcers. I mean, why is the announcer booth empty? It also has this crazy thing going with the ring that almost makes it feel like a rectangle rather than a square. The deeper I dive into the PSX release, the more I feel like it's a late beta that was rushed to be published by Acclaim before their contract expired with Midway. The rest of the game looks good. All in all, the competition for the top 3 places is so tight, it's the small things that make a difference here. The matchup for first comes down to the Saturn and DOS release. These are so darn close, it's hard to pick a winner. But DOS has considerably larger character sprites, putting it on top. There's nothing else really noteworthy that would further separate these two versions, as they are both executed incredibly well. It's time to look at controls and the gameplay experience. With ease, the version at the bottom of the barrel is the SNES release. This is quite frankly a miss. First off, the game experiences severe slowdown when 3 characters are on screen at once, breaking the flow while ending any enjoyment you might have been having. It's a major problem because most of the matches are 2-on-1 handicap or gauntlet style events where there's always 3 characters in the ring. Further issues appear later in the game as it becomes apparent that it doesn't support 4 players in the ring at once. The matches intended to be 3-on-1 are instead turned into a handicap gauntlet match, and the 2-on-2 matches you can experience in every other version are turned into a lopsided 2-on-1 snooze fest. The 1-on-1 matches are honestly fun, but the slowdown ruins the rest of the experience and makes me want to toss this right in the garbage can. If that wasn't enough, my favorite character in-game is Yokozuna. He, along with Bam Bam Bigelow, are excluded from the SNES release, along with any content associated with them. The selection of characters was already small, but without these two, I had matches where I was Bret Hart fighting 3 other Bret Harts. This is, in my opinion, just bad execution. In 5th is the Genesis release. It's a ton of fun, containing nearly everything from the arcade, and supports a mass of controller options, including the ASCII pad, a controller I can only fathom being included as an option due to someone working on the game having a place for it in their heart. There are 2 main issues with the Genesis release that hold it back. First off, you can't move behind the ring. In fact, you can get injured trying to do so. The other issue is slowdown during 4-man matches. It's not as bad as the 3-man matches on the SNES, but it still sucks, making it a game you should for the most part avoid. 4th is the 32X. The game is an enhanced version of the Genesis release, so it maintains all the controller options along with not being able to move behind the ring. Granted, you can only get out of the ring if someone tosses you out, which rarely happens, but it's still an annoyance should that be the route you'd like to take. Thankfully, all the other problems have been solved, and the 32X suffers no slowdown. One of the ways the game achieves this is by locking the frame rate at 30 FPS. Some people feel it gives the game a different feel from the others, but to me, Yokozuna plays the same across all platforms he's on. Beyond measuring frames of animation, I don't have a way of measuring frames in real time across all versions, but I still think it's worth mentioning one more time that the reduced frame rate here does cause a jittering motion during fast gameplay. It doesn't affect gameplay, but it's present in the background and might be a turnoff to some people. 3rd is the DOS release. This version has no issues gameplay-wise, so it comes down to additional options. There are 10 controller settings you can choose from, but they are all either 2 or 4 button configurations. There's also the keyboard for those who can stomach using it in this sort of game. The Saturn comes in 2nd. The main reason it places here is there are 0 controller options. The setup is fine by me, but I still like to have options. The saving grace above the DOS version is it utilizes all 6 buttons, along with the ease of having a second player. You could flip this with the DOS release though, and I wouldn't have many complaints. It's really personal preference, and I prefer the Saturn set up on a massive screen when playing this game. The PSX release easily comes in first. I really love this game, but I'm not a fan of some controller configurations you're stuck with. The PSX without a doubt was the worst setup out of the box. Thankfully, it's also the only version that allows custom button mapping. So by the time I enter the match, all was good in the world of wrestling. The only real complaint is that there's no way to save your setup, so every time you boot the game, you'll have to do this. Overall, I had 0 issues moving between versions, and from a gameplay perspective, when not experiencing slowdown, I could pull off moves with precision in all but the SNES and Genesis release. The slowdown there makes timing a bit harder to master. So, what extras or missing content might each version have? There's said to be secret fatalities for each character, but only the Undertaker's has been confirmed, and only in the arcade release. No one has confirmed any other fatalities existing beyond this one, or if they're even included in the home release. All home versions are also missing the endings included in the arcade. The endings were just a paragraph of cheesy and somewhat dark, morbid text. If I had to guess why these endings remain arcade exclusive, it would have something to do with the ESRB feeling their inclusion warranted an M rating, but this is just a guess. If you like Wang, he did a cool video talking about the weird endings for each character. You might check it out, as I highly recommend his channel, and it's an aspect of the game I'm not covering here. Beyond what I discussed in earlier sections, there is nothing else noteworthy. This brings us to my final recommendation. Last is the SNES release. It's just a very poor port that only executes part of what was expected. The parts it does feature are so poorly optimized, it's an awful mess to experience. Fifth is the Genesis release. Its poor visual representation of the arcade game, along with slowdown during the final and most critical battles, doesn't help win it favor. The unfortunate bit here is had it went the route of the SNES release and removed 4-man matches, it would still be ugly but fun to play from start to finish. Fourth is the PSX. With most of the soundtrack, some graphical assets, and commentary missing, it's almost a contention with the Genesis release for 5th. Thankfully, the gameplay is spot on, so if you're picking up the controller, you're guaranteed to have fun, even if it feels like a late beta trying to meet a milestone. The battle for 2nd and 3rd is a real toss-up, and I couldn't fault anyone who would flip these two. Third is the 32X. Multiple controller options, solid visuals, and a fantastic selection of full chiptune songs makes this rather special. It's a fantastic release worth owning that essentially does everything right. Second is the DOS release. It's not to say there's anything wrong with this version, it is after all a near perfect port of the arcade release. That becomes the problem though, as the short samples of songs remain a part of the DOS version, and for me, it's a bit of a turnoff. I guess it's really telling how good these ports are from this point on, when the arcade release would have ranked about here had it been part of the process. That leaves the Saturn at the top. Whether you like the in-match music is a point of personal preference, and for me, I didn't miss hearing the same track over and over and over again. The improved quality of the audio, Saturn controller, ease of access, and arcade-perfect gameplay is worthy of any trade-off mentioned earlier in this video. It took the arcade release and slightly improved it. In case I haven't beat this point home enough by now, you can't go wrong with the DOS, Saturn, and 32X releases. They are all very well executed in their own right. If you have a PlayStation, the PSX release is great fun, even when considering the missing content. There was a follow-up to this game called WWF In Your House that has ethical questions surrounding its development. By '95, the 5-year contract between Midway and Acclaim was coming to a close. Midway decided to start developing home conversions of their games in-house as the market and most profit had shifted to home releases. Acclaim held the WWF license at the time, allowing Midway to utilize it in the creation of WrestleMania, so while everyone expected Acclaim to continue making wrestling games, the folks at Midway were rather put off when they discovered Acclaim was creating a sequel using Midway's ideas and technology as the base. In addition, Acclaim secured the rights to the NBA Jam license, which was owned by the NBA when it came up for renewal, in effect stealing one of Midway's core IPs. Both properties were very popular when Acclaim took control, and it only took one release to ruin any momentum they had gained under Midway's guidance. Massive shout out to Rian Ali for fact-checking portions of this video. His book covering the history of NBA Jam will be out later this year. I've left a link in the description below and highly recommend you keep an eye out for its pending release. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. Your support means the world to me. As always, feel free to leave a positive or negative comment down below. I try to read and reply to everyone and appreciate the opportunity to interact with you all. Until the next episode, to wherever you may be watching, good morning, good evening, and good night. I'm Jenovi, and you've been watching Retro Impressions.